One child's parents had expressed concern about the class reading Alex Gino's George and discussing transgender identities. When that child was working on a project related to the book, Jill asked if she had some help. The student nodded slowly and said, "My dad checked my work for commas." Because of Fern's strong focus on ELA skills, parents who might not agree with the LGBTQ-related content could find ways to come to terms with what their child was learning by focusing on their ELA skills. End quote. Last April, so roughly a year ago, I started writing a book about queer theory in education. As part of my research, I read everything related to queer theory specifically, and critical pedagogy more broadly, that I could get my hands on. I read Michel Foucault. I read Gail Rubin. I read Judith Butler, Deborah P. Britzman, Kevin Kumashiro, Hannah Dyer, Mary Kay Bryson, James T. Sears, Susan DeCastle, Anna Marie Jagosi, David Halperin. I read Giroux, Gottesman. I reread Freire, Peter McLaren, Joe Kinchelow, and many, many others. I read and read and read because I knew that I could use my talents to expose queer theory. And if I wanted to do it right, I needed to make the book reflect queer theory and queer education on its own terms. I needed to bring as much of the literature as I could to bear on the project, leaving no room for confusion. No room for someone to say the evidence was cherry-picked. I wanted to show, along with James Lindsay, my co-author, that queer theory is rotten to the core. I wanted to show that queer theory is ubiquitous in education, and that fact is a massive, massive problem. In the book, The Queering of the American Child, now available, we quote not just the theorists behind the theory in queer theory, but the practitioners, the people on the ground putting the theory into practice in classrooms nationwide. One of the papers I read early on in my research was Navigating Parental Resistance, Learning from Responses of LGBTQ-Inclusive Elementary School Teachers. Published in Theory into Practice in 2019 by Jill M. Herman Wilmarth, I think that's how you say it, Wilmarth, and Caitlin Law Ryan. This paper floored me, not because I learned anything new about queer theory, but because the authors were so brazen in their admissions. Or at least they were so brazen in sharing the admissions of the teachers that are the paper's focus. The woke are generally clearer in their papers in regards to what they are actually doing in classrooms. I guess they just figure no one outside of the cult, knuckleheads like me, are going to read them. The Mott and Bailey is one of their strongest weapons. To your face, they'll retreat to their Mott and say, "They're just teaching inclusively. Who could be against that?" But as soon as you're gone and they have your kids alone, they venture back out into the Bailey where the insanity of their cult doctrine can breathe some fresh air. The clarity of this paper, with its Mott on full display in the open air, leaves no room for interpretation. It's clearer than most of the papers I've read, and that's shocking, because I read all of Kevin Kumashiro's work, and he says that queer pedagogy works by intentionally placing children into crisis, so the generated anguish, guilt, shame, and anger can be used to push kids into the queer cult. I've written about this paper before, and I've shared much of that on X, but I feel it deserves full coverage in audio format so there can be no reason or excuse to miss its revelations. Every parent with children in school should listen to this podcast, because this podcast is about them. This paper tells the tale of two educators who openly admit to lying and deceiving parents so they can push their, quote, queer work onto kids. The queer activists in our schools know parents object to the insane sex, gender, and sexuality stuff. They know parental resistance is a huge barrier to what they're trying to accomplish. And this paper is a blueprint for overcoming that resistance. A blueprint for overcoming your objections to what's happening in your schools with your children. I've said this many times, but if we don't understand how these radicals think and operate, we can't protect our children from their program. So today, we're going to learn a bit more about how they think and operate. We're going to read most of this paper together and discover the methods queer activists use to bulldoze your concerns and make their program more palatable, their word, so you can, quote, come to terms with it, as the authors describe. I'll start by reading the abstract in full. I'm also going to read most of the introduction to make it clear how this whole project is being framed, because this paper is a massive admission. The authors give away the whole game. If you're a parent who has felt as if you've been gaslit about what's happening in schools, you are not crazy. This paper proves it. Quote, one of the most common responses from pre- and in-service teachers related to addressing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer topics in elementary school is a concern about parents' responses. This article explores these concerns by examining two elementary school teachers' interactions with parents in relation to their LGBTQ-Inclusive teaching. This article provides a possible roadmap for other teachers who are nervous about parental responses to LGBTQ-inclusive teaching and interrupts notions that negative responses from parents are reason enough to avoid including these topics in elementary classrooms. End quote. So, right out of the gate, the authors tell us that teachers are concerned about parents objecting to sex, gender, and sexuality discussions with young children. They tell us the article will explore how two teachers handled these objections and provide a roadmap, a blueprint, for other teachers to do the same thing. Objections and resistance are not reason enough to stop doing what parents don't like, we're told. Quote, for the past decade, through our university teaching to pre-service teachers at our large regional universities, and through our professional development presentations to in-service teachers around the country, we have advocated for inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and families in elementary schools. No matter whether our students and audience members agree or disagree with the wisdom of this recommendation or see the necessity for such inclusion, the single most common response we receive to such suggestions is, quote, what about the parents? Their reaction, echoed in other research, indicates the significant gatekeeping mechanism teachers understand parents to play when it comes to approving or disapproving their curricular choices, especially related to topics that have been historically silenced or that challenge particular communities' beliefs or standards. End quote. Firstly, the authors say they've been doing this for a decade. So this paper was published in 2019, so since at least 2009. They've been training future teachers and current teachers around the country since 2009. So what we're about to learn isn't just two radicals meeting research requirements. These authors are experts who are sought after for their theory and their methods. I have to stress this all of the time. The papers that I share on X and the future ones I hope to share in podcast form like this one are written mostly by practicing teachers. Either people who teach future teachers in schools of education, or people who have taught or currently teach in schools. This isn't just abstract academic stuff. These radicals share what they are doing with actual children in classrooms. Now, notice how right off of the bat, all of this is couched in the language of inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and families in elementary schools. This is the mot, one you will all find familiar. The authors said, quote, "No matter whether our students and audience members agree or disagree with the wisdom of this recommendation," so no matter if they agree or resist, what they're sharing is wisdom. Wisdom is the quality of having experience and knowledge, the quality of having good judgment. They think everyone else's judgment is terrible and oppressive, so we should just accept that they know what's best. Is it, by the way, good judgment to call parents a significant gatekeeping mechanism? Is that wise to admit? They know that parents have a problem with drag queens and pornographic books in schools. They know they shouldn't be practicing queer pedagogy on children. They admit that they see parents as a significant gatekeeping mechanism to brainwashing kids. So the purpose of this paper is to disseminate techniques for overcoming the objections that they know they are going to run into, the objections that are making the teachers nervous. Quote, "When we get such responses, we try to challenge their fear of parents' concerns by reminding them of a few things. First of all, the category of parents is not homogeneously straight and conservative. In many instances, parents are neutral toward, or even explicitly appreciative of, teachers making their classrooms more inclusive. Second, portrayals of sexuality are still present in elementary school classrooms if LGBTQ topics are not included. Think fairy tales and playground kissing games. And finally, we remind them, it's more important to teach children about our diverse world and to ensure that LGBTQ children and families feel safe and included in our schools, rather than to protect a mythical innocence we project onto children that talking about LGBTQ topics might somehow taint." End quote. When teachers ask us how to handle objections and navigate upset parents, we try to challenge those teachers' fear of parental concerns. That's what the authors say. We try to convince teachers that they shouldn't fear parents and they should bulldoze through the resistance they run into. That's what the authors are suggesting here. The category of parents is not homogeneously straight and conservative, the authors say. This is what's called a mystification. It's a magic phrase, a thought-terminating cliche that is supposed to stop teachers from thinking about what's actually going on here so they will accept everything else that follows. In effect, the authors are asking teachers to start considering the sexuality and political affiliations of parents. They have to get teachers to start thinking this way for the rest of the trick to work. If teachers aren't thinking about the sexuality and politics of parents, then you can't socially and emotionally manipulate them by suggesting that the school is already discussing sexuality and politics. It's just doing it in an exclusive and oppressive way, because it's not including the radical queer politics that the authors want to push on kids. The schools already push sexuality on children. They push a heterosexually normative worldview. The schools are heteronormative, to be technical. That's the argument here. The classrooms already push kids into the politics of sex and sexuality. You just can't see it, Mrs. Jones, because you don't have our expertise. The reason parents are significant gatekeeping mechanisms and object to the insanity is because they are straight and conservative, and they don't want to part way with their privilege. Just think of the fairy tales we read to children. Who's kissing in those fairy tales? A man and a woman? Have you ever read a fairy tale where two men kiss? How do you think your exclusion of male-on-male kisses affects the gay children in your class? Do you think it makes them feel represented, seen, celebrated, and heard? Or do you think they notice that you privilege heterosexual kisses, which makes them feel less than, makes them feel invisible? And besides, most parents appreciate inclusion. They appreciate it, celebrate it even. Or, at the very least, they don't care. So what are you so worried about? Don't be fearful. Let me remind you, it's more important to teach children about our diverse world and to ensure LGBTQ children and families feel safe and included in our schools, rather than to protect a mythical innocence we project onto children. Forget about your fear of parents. What's more important, their objections or your call to social justice? Their frustration and anger or your call to teach kids to be inclusive and safe? Parents may be upset about all of the sex, gender, and sexuality stuff, but they're projecting a mythical innocence onto kids. That innocence doesn't exist. Certain people have created the idea of an innocent child and stuffed that category with endless justifications as to why kids can't learn about who they really are on the inside. Justifications as to why kids can't learn about deviant sexual practices in early elementary school. Justifications for why drag queens are wholly inappropriate in schools. Justifications for why the parents should be the sole determiner of the care and upbringing of their children, rather than the radical teachers who would initiate children into our cult. Isn't this framing brilliant? If you're at all familiar with what's happening in schools, you can cut through this bullshit already. But if you're an unsuspecting person, this kind of talk is going to work on you. The language game, the mystification, is going to take you for everything you're worth. How do I know? Well, look at where we're at today. This kind of talk, this talk of inclusion and diversity and safety, has steamrolled people for decades, especially teachers and administrators who want to be seen as good people on the right side of history. I can't really fault them either. This kind of talk used to work on me. It works on most people, which is why it's so important to expose the dynamics at play and share stuff like this paper. Quote, "Yet although these reminders ring true and clear for us, it is also true that parental objections to LGBTQ-inclusive teaching happen, and that teachers who challenge the heteronormativity of elementary schools through their teaching can be vulnerable to such objections and their consequences. Therefore, this article investigates the parental resistance that two classroom teachers in different states and teaching contexts encountered when they included LGBTQ topics in their elementary teaching, and how they navigated such resistance. 3 questions guided our analysis. What kind of parental resistance did they face, if any? In what ways did these teachers navigate parental resistance to LGBTQ-inclusive teaching? And what informed the ways they responded to this resistance? Although every context differs, we hope this research can provide an empirical guide to the kinds of objections that parents might have. Additionally, we provide a blueprint to help pre- and in-service teachers consider as they prepare their own responses." End quote. So, despite the unassailable sales pitch of inclusion, some parents still feel the need to object to pornography and developmentally inappropriate materials, lessons, and conversations in the classroom. These teachers are just challenging the heteronormativity of elementary schools. Okay, let's define heteronormativity, because it is here in the paper for the first time that the authors out themselves explicitly. I'll read this technical definition taken from the academic literature as found in Oswald's Queering the Family, which is found in the Handbook of Feminist Family Studies, published by Sage in 2009, for those that want to go find it for themselves. Quote, "Heteronormativity is an ideological code that promotes rigidly defined conventional gender norms, heterosexuality, and traditional family values. Current social and intimate experiences are defined by a heterosexual-homosexual binary that serves as a method of social control to encourage conformity within the heteronormative power structure. Heteronormativity has very real material consequences for those situated differently in the matrix of domination. Queer scholarship questions how institutionalized heterosexuality ensures that some people will have more power, privilege, status, and resources than others. End quote. Whoa! So that's not as simple as inclusion and safety. That sounds rather radical. It is also true that parental objections to LGBTQ-inclusive teaching happen, and that teachers who challenge the heteronormativity of elementary schools through their teaching can be vulnerable to such objections and their consequences. You mean to tell me that parents objecting to this kind of crazy talk are the problem? I guess so. Teachers who are challenging the ideological code that promotes family values and brainwashes children into stiff gender and sexual roles within the matrix of domination are doing the work of inclusion. They're just making sure all children are truly treated equally, not privileged with more power, resources, and status than others. These poor teachers are falling prey to objections, so what are we going to do about it? We're going to investigate the parental resistance two practicing teachers encountered in their elementary school classrooms when they were simply teaching inclusively, when they were overcoming the significant gatekeeping mechanism parents play. We're going to dive into the blueprint of navigating parental resistance to help pre- and in-service teachers consider their options and strategies as they prepare their own responses, I guess. Okay, with the framing out of the way, we can launch into the theoretical framework the authors approach their blueprint with. I'm going to read this brief section, paragraph by paragraph, which is just 2 in total, to dissect what the authors tell us is their theory, to make it absolutely clear that what's happening here has nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with inclusion as the typical person would define or understand it. Navigating parental resistance has everything to do with practicing queer theory on children, and then manipulating and lying to parents about what's really going on. Quote, "This work draws on critical frameworks," and they cite Freire there, "to help us consider how power circulates with regard to the negotiation of multiple and intersecting identities converging in dialogue. Such identities, including those around sexuality and those of traditional school roles like parent or teacher, inform the ways that teachers and parents relate to each other around classroom practices. The collision of these differently positioned perspectives shapes the kind of questions and responses adults who care deeply about the same children bring to each other with these culturally defined roles. Within these culturally defined roles." End quote. So this work draws on critical frameworks, as in critical Marxist frameworks, to help consider how power circulates in dialogue between people. Paulo Freire's citation is a dead giveaway that what we're dealing with here is brainwashing. What the authors are saying here is that they draw on critical theory broadly, and Paulo Freire's critical theory of education specifically, to understand how they conceptualize education. Education isn't for teaching children to reproduce the current and oppressive society as it is. Education is for critical consciousness, which is defined by Freire as the ability to analyze oppressive structures and systems in order to intervene and change them. Critical consciousness as an awakened consciousness that grants people the ability to analyze all of society, culture, and relationships through the lens of critical theory, and therefore systemic power, and inspires them to become radical Marxist activists who tear away at all of the negative aspects of society that critical theories identify in order to begin to reveal the utopia that can't yet be imagined. That's what the authors mean when they say that critical frameworks help them consider how power circulates. Parents, students, and teachers are flung into an infinitely complex web of power and conflict, granting each group a specific vantage point and perspective that shapes how they view themselves in schools. Critical theory, as in critical Marxist theory, grants the authors the unique insight to determine which questions are valid and which aren't, which concerns are legitimate, and which concerns are just heteronormative immune responses freaking out about the inclusion of queer politics in elementary school classrooms. The authors are saying education is a power play, and parents are too stupid to understand what the purpose of education must be. Education for critical consciousness. Education for social justice. The teachers are adults who care deeply about the same child. They care just as deeply as you do, parents, but they have a unique insight afforded to them by their critical framework, so they actually know what's best for your children. They care as much as you, and they know more than you, so shut up and sit down. Quote, specifically, our analysis focuses on how components of the critical literacy framework that these two teachers used in their teaching also serve to shape their interactions with parents. The work of Lewison, Flint, and Van Sluys informs our use of critical literacy, along with Freire, of course. This approach often includes elements such as disrupting the commonplace, interrogating multiple viewpoints, focusing on socio-political issues, and taking actions to promote social justice. Where critical literacy is a lens that teachers might use when thinking about texts and teaching, we note the elements of this approach to teaching that parallel these teachers' engagement with parental resistance to an LGBTQ-inclusive curriculum. This is appropriate given the ways that critical literacy directs attention to how language, power, and social institutions interact with and affect each other, making it particularly useful for understanding the situation under analysis here. Simultaneously, we use the lens of queer theory, and they cite Britzman, Deborah P., of course, Judith Butler, and Michel Foucault, to inform our understanding of how, why, and where discussions of non-normative genders and sexualities become marked as deviant by others, particularly in classrooms, and particularly around elementary-aged children. End quote. The authors say the teachers they are going to talk about employ a critical literacy framework, meaning Paulo Freire's framework. Freire's whole shtick was that learning to read in education isn't the learning objective. Learning to read situations critically, as in learning to read the world as a Marxist does, is the true objective. Learners must be able to read situations as a Marxist does. Read the politics that words and situations represent, so that they can develop a voice of the oppressed and become revolutionaries inspired by what Drew called the prophetic vision of social justice. A critical literacy approach, in their own words, is about disrupting the commonplace, interrogating multiple viewpoints, focusing on socio-political issues, and taking action to promote social justice. Disrupting, interrogating, focusing on politics, and taking action as activists. Remember, we're reading a paper about teachers working with elementary children in schools. Critical literacy is the lens these teachers use to understand how they must deal with parents, to understand how they must think about language, power, and social institutions when preparing to combat parental concerns about what they're doing in the classroom. Simultaneously, the authors say we use queer theory, citing Deborah P. Britzman, an OG queer theorist who was one of the first to apply queer theory to education in the 90s. They mentioned Judith Butler, the queen of queer theory and the person who put the trouble in gender, and Michel Foucault, the progenitor of queer theory, a communist who escaped accusations of pedophilia only in death after years of fighting against age of consent laws. Queer theory informs their understanding of how all of the sex, gender, and sexuality stuff they know parents object to. They know parents hate this shit, which is why they wrote this paper to evangelize effective methods for shutting parents up. Okay, we can now move on to the details of inclusive teaching that stupid parents keep getting in the way of. The authors discuss two teachers, both practicing in the Midwest. Quote, one site was Linda's racially and economically diverse public school in a large urban district. The other site was Fern's small private school, end quote. Both teachers are veterans with 20 years of experience, we're told. Now, this tidbit turns out to be quite important because queer theory was not yet ascendant in elementary schools 20 years prior to the publication of this paper. It had already overtaken the academy. That took less than a decade, and what Richie Wilkins, a queer theorist, once called, quote, an amazing conquest of academia. But it wasn't practiced in elementary schools 20 years ago. So these teachers weren't brainwashed by queer theory while receiving their own education. What this tells us is that these teachers were radicalized later, in the field, likely through ongoing professional development trainings, the types of training meant to get at teachers who aren't yet down with queer theory. This timeline is important because it's an indication that it doesn't matter how much experience your teachers have, when they graduated, or how old they are. They may still be susceptible to the radicalization, even those veterans who teach in private schools like Fern. If you think you don't have to peek under the hood of your private schools or your teachers, you're making a big mistake, in my opinion. The authors also note that these teachers were quick to incorporate, quote, social justice topics around race and class into their teaching, end quote, but that their adoption of queer theory began more recently, and it's mostly done through reading in English language arts curriculum. So it's mostly done in a way where there isn't a paper trail, or in a way that is couched in something unassuming. They aren't coming out and saying, we're talking queer theory today, kiddos. No, but more details on that soon. Through their very rigorous research, the authors found that, quote, when it came to Linda and Fern's work with parents, only a small portion of interactions were negative. Contrary to the fears of many teachers, the vast majority of Linda and Fern's students' parents never expressed objections or resistance to their LGBTQ-inclusive teaching, end quote. So don't worry, teachers. You can do it because it's only the bigots that hate it. I would venture to say that most, if not all, parents would have been up in arms expressing their objections and resistance if they knew what was really happening, if they were told what inclusion actually means in practice, or if they had read this paper all the way through. Quote, throughout these different points, Linda and Fern's vision of their role as critical literacy educators proved to be hugely influential in establishing how they thought about and negotiated their curriculum and possible parental resistance to their teaching, especially because it provided them with a perspective on teaching and a place to stand from where they could be answerable to others. Central to both teachers' critical literacy lens was a critique of power. To Fern and Linda, parents who resisted LGBTQ-inclusive teaching represent status quo power relations that deny equality to those deemed outside of typically represented identities. In their interactions with resistant parents, Linda and Fern lay bare this notion through their language, choices, and expectations, even as they accounted for the ways that parents in their community understood power and the place of power in the classroom. To illustrate this, we now detail the specific ways Linda and Fern each negotiated parental resistance throughout various points of their planning and teaching." End quote. Linda and Fern saw their role as critical literacy educators, meaning not as educators at all, but as facilitators of brainwashing sessions. We really can't derail here and go into Freire's program full hog, but the gist is this. As I was saying earlier, a critical educator doesn't teach kids how to read or write or do math, for that matter. They teach kids to read their world critically, which is to say, as a Marxist would. The point is to teach kids to interpret their lives through the lens of various critical theories, in this instance, queer theory. The point is to use regular classroom instruction as a mediator for political literacy lessons, teaching kids how to view everything in their lives as a political struggle that they must be prepared to engage in, lest they desire to be on the wrong side of history, which is totally not cool and earns you 0 street cred. So, Linda and Fern negotiate their curriculum through a critical lens, through the lens of critical theory, which provides them with a Marxist perspective to stand from when the parents ultimately come a-knockin'. When parents do catch on to what's really going on, Linda and Fern saw them as representations of the status quo power relations, which is to say, Linda and Fern saw them as the enemy, saw them as people who are attempting to conserve the current socio-political order, conserve the innocence and stability of their children. That can't be tolerated. So Linda and Fern deployed several strategies to combat parents in their classrooms. And here we get into the Mott of the Mott and Bailey strategy behind inclusive teaching. Here we get into the indefensible positions that parents would never tolerate in their schools if they found out teachers conspired in this way. The first technique the authors discuss takes place through curriculum planning. Quote, "The first place where Linda and Fern's LGBTQ-inclusive teaching was shaped by parental resistance was in their curriculum planning. For example, Linda and her grade-level team members," so a whole team of teachers are doing this, "often used a larger unit, frequently a year-long inquiry, to frame their curricular choices." So they used a large unit to smuggle in their curricular choices. That's what this means. Linda, for example, used an exploration of being problem solvers as an opportunity to read LGBTQ-inclusive books alongside books about other issues of oppression, such as racism, classism, and sexism. Oh, you're upset your kid is learning to be an activist rather than to read? So you're against problem solving. Hey everyone, look at this far-right winger. They're afraid of teaching their child how to be a problem solver. People make me angry. Although she understood the pedagogical value of this kind of framework, she also explicitly appreciated its value in rationalizing her choices for parents. So, she understood that couching the inappropriate conversations in the language of problem solving was a way to claim rationality and trick parents into accepting it. Okay, nice admission. As Linda said, "I think it's nice to have that. We're doing this because we can really justify the inclusion of LGBTQ topics for parents." The texts in this way didn't stand on their own as a reflection of a separate agenda, but instead were part and parcel of larger learning goals. See, the radical agenda isn't some easily identifiable thing parents can pinpoint and demand to be removed. No, no, no. The radical agenda is hidden in larger learning goals. Actually, the agenda is woven into everything, and it's actually the entire learning objective. Linda also chose to explicitly share these frameworks and units with parents at the beginning of the year to inform them of the kinds of texts and approaches she would be using, but she was particular about the words she used to describe them. See, she told parents, no one should or can ever object. No, she was particular about the words she used to describe them. She was manipulative and deceitful. As she said, I like the language that says teachers teach inclusively. See, they tell you the Mott and Bailey. The Mott is teaching inclusively. The Bailey is queer pedagogy, practicing queer theory on children. I like the language that says teachers teach inclusively because it helps frame it for parents in a way that is more palatable for anybody who might have an issue. To Linda, more general language was strategic, or, as she said, palatable, and therefore was less likely to receive critique. So the teachers generalized the language. They cast magic spells called diversity, equity, inclusion, safety, and belonging. They make it seem innocent and straightforward. Your kid is just learning to be a problem solver, just learning in an inclusive environment. But it's all deception. It's all done to make it palatable, they say, for parents. My God. Now we turn to Fern, who also employs these strategies in her curriculum planning. Quote, Fern, the only upper elementary teacher at her school, and remember this is a private school, also situated her LGBTQ-inclusive teaching within a larger study. Her students' exploration of gender and transgender topics, for example, was contextualized within their year-long investigations of social justice and identity. These topics included environmental racism in the Flint water crisis, the removal of the Confederate flag from the State House in South Carolina, Japanese internment camps during World War II, and an inquiry into the absence of the history of women and people of color on the timeline bordering the walls of their classroom. Because LGBTQ identities were not the only identities students were investigating, Fern hoped the class's study of LGBTQ-inclusive books and topics would not stand out as odd or problematic to parents. End quote. So, Fern also couches the brainwashing into larger units of study, but perhaps more shockingly and tellingly, the unit she hides queer theory in is a larger unit where other woke theories are practiced on kids. Queer theory is so objectionable that critical race theory can't hold a candle to it. Oh, I know I'm paying tens of thousands of dollars a year to have a teacher tell my kid they have whiteness and should feel shame when showing up to class and turning their homework in on time. But at least the teacher isn't convincing my girl she's a boy. Oh, how far we've fallen. How successful has woke Marxism been to get to a point where a teacher doesn't have to hide the fact that they are an insanely radicalized political agent? And what does it say about queer pedagogy? That the teachers know they have to hide it in larger lessons centered on critical race pedagogy. Very not good. Not good at all. Quote, both teachers also drew on the authority of their mandated curriculum to validate their decisions, mobilizing the official discourse of administrator and parental expectations as justification for, and to create cover for, their queer work. End quote. Excuse me? Using the authority of the mandated curriculum as cover for their queer work? That's a shocking admission. Parents expect that the mandated curriculum reflect rigorous expectations for children to learn the things that they need to learn, like reading, writing, and math. They certainly don't expect radicals to hide their agenda in the authority of a mandated curriculum to create cover for the brainwashing program, to create cover for their queer work. Quote, as Linda explained, I can justify it curricularly. I don't do anything that's inappropriate. This is particularly interesting given that traditionally, the idea of appropriateness has been employed by parents and others worried about the inclusion of queer topics as an attack against inclusive teaching. Here, Linda disrupted more common notions of appropriateness, making the term about the learning that students do and the ways that learning fits within curriculum, rather than about a particular construction of sexuality. End quote. So, the teacher can justify the queer work she wants to do because she can point to state standards and say, I'm not doing anything inappropriate here. Besides, this is the mandated curriculum. Take it up with the Department of Education. The authors mention that using the appropriate versus inappropriate framing is interesting. What did they mean by that? They mean that traditionally, parents have had solid cases for rejecting queer theory in schools because the material is wholly inappropriate. Discussions about sex and sexuality on queer theory's terms have no place in elementary classrooms, if at all. The authors say that pointing to the absolute inappropriateness of queer work has been something parents have employed to stop radicals from sexualizing and brainwashing their children. Wait, no. They say it's something parents have done because they're bigots who don't want their children to learn inclusion. What a joke. They say that Linda disrupted common notions of appropriateness. She frames her queer work as inclusive learning, as learning that's part of the mandated curriculum. She hides behind the authority of her state's Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Education. Hides behind bureaucracy and administrative power to push her queer work on kids. It's not about sexuality. It's not inappropriate. It's just about inclusion. Quote, Fern also grounded her pedagogical focus firmly within the literacy skills, typically taught at the upper elementary level, in ways she knew would satisfy her students' parents. She foregrounded traditional literacy skills while asking students to read, write, and research, even when the subject of that work was transgender people's need for access to bathrooms that match their gender identity. End quote. This is not surprising. We've already been told that critical literacy is the goal. Not learning to read and write as any normal person would understand it, but learning to read the world of oppression and write the new world through activism. This is Paulo Freire's program applied to education, specifically as a vehicle to deliver queer theory, to deliver queer work to kids. If a parent argued that she had an agenda, she knew she could show them how that agenda was centered in her responsibilities to develop students' literacy. Do you see how wicked this is? I'm just teaching your kids to read and write. That's my agenda. No. You're a queer activist teaching kids how to read their world through the lens of queer theory and write their new lives as cult initiates living queer theory, practicing queer theory on themselves and their world. Ugh. The high expectations that she had of their literacy skills placed ELA and LGBTQ-Inclusive teaching on equal ground. For example, one child's parents had expressed concern about the class reading Alex Gino's George and discussing transgender identities. When that child was working on a project related to the book, Jill asked if she had some help. The student nodded slowly and said, "My dad checked my work for commas." Because of Fern's strong focus on ELA skills, parents who might not agree with the LGBTQ-related content could find ways to come to terms with what their child was learning by focusing on their ELA skills. End quote. She hid her agenda behind the authority of mandated English language arts curriculum. George is a book written for 8 to 12-year-olds. It's about a 10-year-old transgender girl, meaning a 10-year-old boy who thinks he is a girl. The book mentions pornography. George's older brother Scott bangs on the door of the bathroom his brother is in because, quote, "Dude, I thought you had porn or something in there. His brother thinks George is taking so long in the bathroom because he's, quote, looking at dirty magazines. Again, written for children as young as 8. That's a violation of appropriateness in and of itself. But I would argue that the more inappropriate thing is suggesting that children as young as 10, George's age, can and should consider whether they might be trans. The book opens up endless possibilities for discussing and brainwashing of children into queer theory. The kids see a character their age being bullied, being oppressed, and coming out on top. A celebratory story of the power of self-identification and an oppressive world that just doesn't want you to be who you really are on the inside. The authors say the kids read the book and then discussed transgender identities. I wonder what those conversations looked like. I wonder what was discussed. We can use our imagination. We can also observe that discussions don't have paper trails. You, as the parent, may never know what was discussed, may never know how deceptive and manipulative that discussion was. What was your child told? You may never know. Oh, and by the way, the book also mentions that George found information about being transgender on the internet after his brother, quote, taught her, Melissa, George's new name, how to clear the web browser history on mom's computer, end quote. Evil, wicked, inappropriate. Couched in the mandated ELA curriculum so parents are forced to stomach it. Because of Byrne's strong focus on ELA skills, parents who might not agree with the content could find ways to come to terms with what their child was learning by focusing on ELA skills. You know, I really think all of this is inappropriate, but it's mandated, and at least my child is developing their reading and writing. Let's focus on that. I've come to terms with it all. Absolutely wicked. Quote, Fern also faced parental resistance to teaching Gino's George, and the ways that she asked students to consider gender and gender pronouns as the class prepared for that reading. End quote. And how did Fern handle the objections? Well, she spoke to the parent who was objecting and tried to help them, quote, understand how an overarching discussion of how gender works in daily language was merely a foreground for understanding transgender identities. She informed the parent that the school community, like all communities, had transgender people in it, and that part of her work as teacher was helping all students see themselves reflected in the curriculum. End quote. So she did what all woke people do. She battered the parent over the head with a Mott and Bailey morality play. Remember, we're just teaching inclusively here, not practicing queer pedagogy. That's a conspiracy theory. Fern said that the school community had transgender people in it, and that her work was to help all students see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So we can assume that the school community includes students who identify as transgender. Therefore, their curriculum must reflect their transgenderism so that all children feel included. But here's the problem. There is no such thing as a transgender child. There is no such thing as a transgender child. That's made up magic. The very savage Billboard Chris often says, there is no such thing as a transgender child. There are two sexes, infinite personalities, and all children are beautiful as they are. No need to push regressive stereotypes on kids and convince them that they were born in the wrong body. There's a possibility that a child that attends the school was born with developmental abnormalities, of course, like intersex conditions, although those conditions presenting as sexual ambiguity are fantastically rare and certainly don't disprove the sex binary, like the end, case closed. There's also certainly a possibility that some kids happen to be gay or lesbian. Don't sexualize those kids. Don't convince them to chemically castrate themselves because they are gay. That's horrific, wicked, and evil. There is a 100% chance that many kids are sex confused in this school because of what teachers like Fern are doing to them at a very vulnerable and confusing age. But there is no transgender child at that school. Transgenderism is a cult magic word. It's fantasy. It's a term wielded to smash through parental objection to cult initiation in schools. A term, the author suggests, that Linda and Fern are very good at wielding against parental resistance. Quote, Fern and Linda call parents to take action. Either choose to allow your child to continue to learn in LGBTQ-inclusive ways, or choose to teach your child that not everyone deserves a place at the table. Their classrooms will be inclusive. Any change to that arrangement must be initiated by parents. End quote. It is so important that parents understand what's really happening in schools. These academics tell you what they're doing. They openly admit to deceiving and manipulating parents so they can practice queer theory on kids. If you know what's really going on and how all of this works, you could tell educators like Linda and Fern to pound sand. This isn't either we do this insanely radical and wholly inappropriate thing with your child or you're a bigot. That framing is their framing, and we don't have to accept it. On the contrary, we must reject it and move out of the wizard circle. We don't have to play their game. We can name the dynamics at play. We can say, you're doing queer pedagogy with my kid, and I won't tolerate it. I'm going to use whatever skills and resources I have to discuss this insanity with every other parent in the school. We're going to expose what you're doing and put a stop to it. We're not bigots. This essentially has nothing to do with protecting gay and lesbian kids. This has everything to do with you initiating our children into the cult, a cult that we understand now because we're doing our own research, talking to one another, and we see what's going on in schools nationwide. To plug the book, we've read The Queering of the American Child, and we're on to you. Stop it now. We will not tolerate this behavior. We're talking to our children more. We're preparing them to spot what you're doing. We're preparing them to discuss what they learn at school around the dinner table. You cannot navigate this level of parental resistance. The lawsuits are coming.